Family.
Morning.
I'm excited to see all of you. Some faces that were here for first service too. Before we start this meaty sermon, let's have a word of prayer together. Dear God, I thank you so much for this wonderful church family, and today I just praise you because I felt the mood and the energy in this room and the love that these people have, and I am so glad to see that, and I feel so lucky to be in that kind of a church family. I ask that you'd give us wisdom, guidance, and understanding as we go through this sermon today, and help us to be a little bit offended, but not too offended, enough to make a change in our lives and live even better for you. Thank you so much for the way you work. In your name, amen. How many eldest children do we have in this room? Wow, less than first service. So the rest of you are all younger or only children. Well, I am an eldest child of two. I have one little sister who's about 5.5 years younger than me. And those of you who are eldest siblings could probably relate to this. The ability of an eldest child to assert your power over your younger sibling and get them in trouble a lot more than you perhaps get in trouble. Sorry to all the younger siblings, but just kind of a talent of being the eldest apparently. Well, when I was a kid, I believed that my supposed maturity as the eldest sibling gave me a right to thwart all stories of misconduct to my advantage. In simpler words, it was easy to get my parents to believe me because I was older. So they expected that I would have more life experience and knowledge than my little sister who's 5.5 years younger, that I should know better, that I should tell the truth more. But of course, I mastered the art of manipulation and storytelling to try and get myself out of everything. I also tended to have a takeover sort of mentality as a child. It's terribly embarrassing. But we have these great home videos that my dad found a little over a year ago, where my sister's a baby, maybe a toddler, just learning to walk probably, can kind of get herself around somewhat. And my parents had put out an Easter egg hunt for us because it was Easter. So we were in the backyard and there was all these eggs. You can see them plainly. We're little kids, so it's not hard to find them. But being older and faster than my little sister, I quickly run around the yard and get all the eggs in my basket. And then because I guess I'm feeling a little bit nice, I just shove some in her basket, but don't even give her time to even look for the eggs. And then later in the video, we're sitting at the dinner table. She's in her high chair and she's just sitting peacefully eating. The camera's focused on her, this pretty little baby. And then my head pops in. Dad, can you see me? Dad, can you see me yet? Am I in the picture? Can you see me, Dad? I was not a subtle child, apparently. My friends and I would sometimes play terrible tricks on my little sister as well, as if she hadn't been through enough already. One of the things that we love to do, so mean, please forgive me, but we would put one of my friends at the bottom of our staircase to the basement, and we would be at the top of the staircase with my sister. And she's probably a little older, maybe 4 years old by this point, but gullible enough to believe anything that I tell her. So we told her, at the bottom of the stairs in the basement, we have a big surprise for you. So you have to go down and get it. Well, we turn the lights on, and she believes me, so she starts walking down the stairs. And it's one of those stairs that curves like this, so she can't see the bottom and what's at the end. And once she gets to the landing halfway down, we would switch the lights off, and my friend at the bottom of the stairs would jump up and scare her, and she would scream and cry and be so upset. It was terribly mean of us. A little bit funny, but terribly mean. And of course our parents would come running when they hear my sister screaming and crying, so we didn't get away with that trick too many times, but enough that she'll never let me forget it. I'm glad she still loves me. On a more spiritual note, in my childhood, I still had this domination sort of opinion because I had grown up as an eldest child and an Adventist who believed that everything I believed was right. So I would get into arguments with some of my friends over beliefs. And I made some friends who came from another denomination that was quite opposite from Adventism, very differing beliefs. And we would talk about the different things we believed, more like argue than talk. And I would try and proof text everything and prove to them that Adventism was right and it was the only way to go, and I would just argue my opinion strongly. Finally got to the point where my friend told me they didn't want to talk to me about the Bible anymore. And it was quite a few years before we saw each other again and made things right, thankfully. And I realized a few years later that using forceful argumentation as a means to win someone to the church is not the appropriate way to go about things. Good thing I apologized, and we're friends now, it's all good. I was very zealous for my beliefs, which is a good thing, but I was presenting them to my friends in an unkind and overbearing way, just like how I was treating my little sister in an unkind and overbearing way. So now we look at today's sermon title, Death to Big Stories. What does that mean? What is a big story, and why does it need to die? Well, the phrase big stories is a simplified version of a bigger word, meta-narratives, which you can see up there. And a meta-narrative, if you can parse words apart, meta being a big and the narrative a story, big stories. The word originated from a French philosopher, see if I can get his name right, Jean-François Lyotard, something like that, I don't know. Anyways, he lived in the 1900s, born in 1924, died in 1998, so not that long ago. So these postmodern and meta-narrative philosophies aren't that old. But a meta-narrative is basically a great big story, something which gives a comprehensive account of historical events, or in our case as Christians, perhaps biblical events and theology, based on an appeal to universal truths and values. It's just like a big, overarching story which encompasses many little stories within it. An example you might understand could be the story of salvation, or the great controversy, or the gospel, and so on. These are all big stories that obviously have lots of little details mixed within them. A more contemporary definition of a meta-narrative would be a story that is told to justify another story, or a story about yourself which expresses your own views and experiences. Kind of like how, as a kid, maybe I would try and convince my parents that I was telling the truth because I was the older sibling and had more power over my little sister. Not the case now. But in the case of the Adventist Church, we could say a story about the gospel from an Adventist perspective. Basically, a meta-narrative is a big story that gives an explanation for everything that happens in society. But let's look at this topic of meta-narratives in a more religious lens, using it to address the Bible and examples from religious history and how it affects us and the church today. If we look at the Bible, an example of a good biblical narrative or meta-narrative might be that the Bible is a story of God's self-revelation to the world. Does that sound like a good way to interpret what the Bible is? You could agree with that? But it's just one way of explaining the point of the Bible. Can you think of others? Yeah, you can nod or shake your head, either way. Can you think of other things, maybe? Are there other ways you could think of describing to the person next to you the purpose of the Bible or what its overarching theme is? Well, the ideas that you come up with are probably going to be a little bit different than the person next to you, even though you might share a lot of the same beliefs and values and presuppositions. In this sermon series that we've been looking at some differences between the philosophical time period of modernism and how it affected Christianity, and postmodernism, which is more where we are today, and how these two ideas have influenced the church and Christianity and even Adventism. To summarize modernism, it is a worldview that started around the Enlightenment period, 17th to 18th centuries, and during this time, science replaced the church in being the primary social influence. Modernism affected Christianity in that its approach to religion came from a place of rationalism using reason as a means to search for absolute truth. The Adventist Church was founded not long after these ideas had been circulating in the religious world. So, Adventism is generally pretty good at knowing and explaining things logically. Our emphasis has often been on knowing and having the truth of the Bible. And none of this is bad. But sometimes it leaves vacancies in other areas of human thought, or it could assert itself a bit too much, maybe like me as a child. Postmodernism, then, came in the 1900s, not that long ago, as a reaction to everything that was happening in the modernist Christian world. And postmodernism is a way of thinking which denies absolutes and objectivity. So it's kind of opposite in some ways. Postmodernism thinks that there are more ways to know God and have a relationship with God than just through reason and rationalism. It appreciates different cultures. It appreciates different perspectives. And realizing that each person, even in this room, has a dynamically different worldview which is shaped around the things that they have experienced. So our meta-narratives, or big stories, came more out of the modern line of thinking, saying that we can find this absolute truth and we can tell these big stories that are absolutely correct from our own perspective. But as we look into the Bible itself, we can see that this isn't always the best way to go about things. Having the biggest, loudest story doesn't mean that it always leads to absolute truth and correctness. So let's turn to our scripture for today, Numbers chapter 13, verse 30 through chapter 14, verse 4. Here the Israelites have been led by Moses out of Egypt, and they've finally reached the edge of the land of Canaan, the land that God has promised them. They have sent spies into the land to scout it out and bring back a report of what it's like and what the people groups are like in this new land. Caleb and some of the other Israelites have gone out as spies and have just returned to tell the Israelites a report of what this land is like. So let's read together. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Then the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." So they brought the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." As we look at this story, in a way, the spies were right. The Nephilim inhabiting the land of Canaan at this time are regarded by many scholars as being giants, definitely a lot taller than me, people of great strength, doing many evil things, and no doubt the spies who came across their settlements and these people were frightened by their stature and their power. But if we can turn this into a classroom a little bit, what is the meta-narrative in this story?
Can't go in.
Yes. The spies are telling the Israelites, "We will die if we go into the land of Canaan, so we should go back to Egypt instead." But there's a huge problem with that meta-narrative, isn't there? The Israelites were forgetting that their power came from God, that He had brought them through all of these things just in their recent past. He had brought them out of Egypt and performed so many miracles on their behalf. And yet, at the first sign of trouble, they just run and cry and get so annoyed and complain to Moses and Aaron. They let the bigger story, the meta-narrative here, stomp out that smaller story. They don't listen to the other perspective. Caleb's story is quickly skipped over. Even though his story is obviously a better outcome, they would get to possess the land of Canaan, which God had promised to them. They would get to see how God would move and work on their behalf. And if they had just trusted God, and instead of listening to that biggest story, they would have prevailed against these people right away in the land of Canaan. But because they let the big story outweigh the little one, they missed the truth entirely. This is the problem that postmodernism has with meta-narratives. Our philosopher defined postmodernism as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. Postmodernism's concern is that we cannot know that a certain big story gives all the answers and meaning to life and defines all that is true. Ultimately, only God can construct a true and absolute meta-narrative. We, as sinful humans, cannot, is what this view is saying. And I'd say postmodernism is correct in its assertion that we can't know this absolute truth and be absolutely positive about every little thing, because we aren't God. Our tendency, though, especially in the Adventist church, I have noticed, is to search by reason for absolute truth about God and try and prove it. We like to have all the answers, to be able to prove our beliefs, but ultimately every human interpretation will break down at some point. It won't be completely perfect all the time. So we can't know, explain, or define something absolutely. This means that when we try and make our own meta-narratives or big stories to explain the Bible or God or theology or religion in general, they really are just one perspective of that story and not the whole absolute truth of that story. And that's what postmodernism is trying to point out. That we explain a meta-narrative from our own framework, how we see things. It is our own attempt from our own perspective and our own understanding to explain God or the Bible or whatever the topic may be. So therefore, how you tell that story, that meta-narrative, relies heavily on your own worldview, correct? On the things you have experienced. In that sense, I could almost say that it isn't even a true meta-narrative, but just an attempt at explaining something from within your own framework. As Adventists, the problem that we run into is this. We often try and explain things away so that no more questions can be asked. We are quick to judge other people's perspectives and stories. We believe firmly that our version of the story is the only correct version. and that no one else can hold any piece of truth. We think we've got it, and we tell others that they don't. The danger in this is that we actually end up driving people away from the Bible and away from Christ because how we are telling the story is all wrong. Meta-narratives aren't necessarily a bad thing. They're just often presented incorrectly. You can't go demonizing other people's stories just because they are different from yours. A great example of this, to give you something a little more concrete, would be to look back to the Middle Ages, a time when the Catholic Church ruled the religious Christian world. We see a great example of them having this huge meta-narrative that stamped out all other stories, because the Catholic Church said that you had to believe and worship exactly the way that they told you to, and if you did anything different, you would be burned at the stake. And then when we look a little further into that history, we find out that both Catholics and Protestants on both sides of these religious wars were trying to assert their story as the big correct story, the way that religion needed to be done. And it turned into a big bloody mess that is remembered as a very dark time in human history. So how can we avoid acting like the beast of the Middle Ages and stop ourselves from stamping out other people's stories while still holding up truth? It's quite obvious, but I'd say the first rule of thumb is to be respectful. Be nice people. We can't use our story to put other people down. And since I was just talking about the Catholic Church, we will use that as an example. Just because our big story in Adventism sometimes puts a black spot on Catholicism in prophecy doesn't mean that we have a right to bash Catholics, or to be unkind to our Catholic neighbors, or to be rude to our Catholic co-workers, or criticize their dedication to their faith. Amen. We must never use our meta-narrative to put others down. We must also remember that within our own church, our own denomination, our own congregation here, we all have different stories and experiences, and these influence the way that we tell the greatest story about Christ. So, how we tell that story is going to be just as important as the story itself. If we tell it with love and with care and kindness, it will be much better received than if we spread it with argumentation and bashing someone over the head with biblical knowledge. Since we all have different worldviews and different perspectives on our faith as Christians, we also shouldn't go criticizing our brothers and sisters within our own church. I know what happens on Facebook sometimes. You read something and just your fingers get going. But you got to remember, we all have different perspectives, and we need to respect that other people are going to tell the story differently than we do. Keep striving for truth, though. I don't want you to take away from this sermon that I'm saying that our attentiveness to knowledge and truth in the Bible is a bad thing, because that's not what I'm saying at all. Quite the opposite, really. We should keep searching for truth. That is a good thing to do. But as a church, we're already pretty good at that. We've got lots of resources that help us out with that. Now what we need to do is learn to transfer that passion into the way we share it with others, so that it is communicated kindly, not as an overarching meta-narrative that crushes all stories, like what happened in the Middle Ages, for example. But what is all this philosophical languages, meta-narratives, and postmodernism and stuff? How does this all look like in the practical day-to-day when I'm sitting across the table from you circumstance? I'd say it looks like going to Bible studies with people of other faiths than you. Going to conferences, religious conferences, or concerts of people that might not be from your same church. I've heard some people, even in this congregation, come up and talk to me about how they've gone to Bible studies led by people of other faiths, and it can be a struggle sometimes. Speaking out about something or not speaking out about something when you are convicted of something. It means letting somebody else process verbally what they are learning about God in their own life, however they need to and how they feel comfortable. And if they choose to share it with you, listening, and not necessarily quick disagreeing with them, but listening to what it is that they're going through in their mind. It means being kind and respectful to your fellow Adventists, even when you think maybe they are far too liberal and on the road to hell, or far too conservative and missing the point altogether. But ultimately, it means focusing on your own relationship with Christ, so that when you do tell that story about him, it is drawing from a well of time spent with him. I want us to remember Jesus' response to a question asked of him in Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 to 40. If you want to turn there or write it down for later, you probably know. It says, "Teacher," they're asking the question of him, "which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and all the prophets hang on these two commandments." In other words, according to Jesus, the truest meta-narrative of the law is to love God with all your heart and soul and mind, and also to love your neighbor as yourself. And so if we follow his advice, I don't think we'll have to worry too much. How we share that message is just important as the message itself. And with Christ's love, we can be confident that both will be accomplished.
Amen. Amen.
Let's bow our heads for prayer. Dear God, I thank you for the Sabbath, a day of rest, a time to gather together in communion with one another and with you, to make friends, to see old friends, make new ones, and a time to dig into your word and study the things that we believe and study our faith. I ask that you would help us not to be a church that stamps out other people's opinions or is rude or argumentative, but rather a church that shows love and kindness, isn't afraid of questions, and is willing to sit down and have a good conversation about faith. I ask that you would give us each divine appointments, that you would help us to meet people whose lives we can help change and who we can help influence for the better for you. I thank you for this school and the way that it reaches out to children. I ask that you would bless it, send angels to protect it, and help each one of us as we go about our day to not forget these big philosophical words, but think about them and chew on them a little bit during lunch. And help us to not be afraid of tackling those hard subjects sometimes. Ultimately, God, help us to focus on our relationship with you and grow closer to you each day. In your name, amen.